After my mother died, the house went quiet in a way that felt unfinished. Weeks later, her quilt, folded at the foot of my bed, began to reveal things I was never meant to see. I grew up in a small, weather-worn town where winters lingered and words were scarce. My mother was known for her quilts, for the way her hands moved steadily while her voice stayed still. When she passed, she left behind a house full of fabric, dust, and unasked questions, and I returned home believing grief would be simple and contained. The house didn't creak the way it used to. Not after the funeral. It stood still, like it was waiting for instructions it would never receive. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains and settled on the floor in long, pale stripes. Dust hovered inside it, slow and deliberate, as if even the air had learned to move carefully. I stood in the hallway for a long time without taking my coat off. My hand rested on the doorframe, feeling the faint groove worn there by years of passing through. The house felt altered. Not broken. Just paused. Like it was holding its breath and expecting me to notice. The kettle sat cold on the stove. Her mug was still by the sink, ringed with a faint brown circle she never quite scrubbed away. Everything was where it had been. That was the hardest part. Death hadn't rearranged anything. It had only removed the one person who knew why things were placed the way they were. I walked slowly, listening to my steps. The floor creaked once, softly, like it remembered me. Each room felt dimmer than I remembered, even though the bulbs were the same. Light fell differently now. It caught on corners. Lingered where it hadn't before. It brushed against folded cloth on the back of the couch, against loose thread caught on a lampshade. Her sewing room was at the end of the hall. The door was open. It always was. The chair sat slightly pulled back from the table. Not pushed in. Not abandoned. Just paused mid-motion. A pair of scissors lay open, their metal dull with age. Pins were still lined neatly in their cushion, heads glinting faintly. Fabric was stacked in small, careful piles, edges aligned like she might return any second to finish sorting them. I didn't step inside right away. I stood there and watched the room breathe. Or maybe that was me. The silence pressed in. Not loud. Not empty. It had weight to it. It filled the space between things. It asked something of me, though I didn't yet know what. I touched the back of the chair. It was cool. Solid. Real. She hadn't stepped away forever. My body wanted to believe. She'd just gone to the bathroom. Or out to the garden. Or into the next room to check on something she forgot she was holding. I left the room untouched. All day, I moved carefully, like sound might disturb whatever fragile balance was keeping the house upright. I opened drawers slowly. I closed doors with my palm flat against the wood. The clock in the living room ticked louder than it ever had before. Each second felt intentional. By evening, the sky dimmed into a soft grey blue. The kind that comes before rain but doesn't promise it. I turned on only one lamp. The rest of the house stayed in shadow. That's when I noticed the quilt. It was folded over the arm of the couch. One of hers. I couldn't remember when she'd last used it. Or if she ever had. The fabric looked worn but cared for. Corners softened by time. Colors muted, like they'd learned restraint. I sat beside it for a while before touching it. When I finally did, my fingers sank into the thickness of it. Heavier than I expected. Denser. Like it was holding something back. I lifted it slowly, careful not to shake it out. The weight surprised me again as I carried it down the hall. It pressed into my arms, solid and grounding. Not uncomfortable. Just present. My bedroom felt smaller than I remembered. I spread the quilt over the bed, smoothing it with both hands. The fabric was cool at first, then slowly warmed under my palms. It smelled faintly of cedar and soap. Of her. Of closed drawers and winter afternoons. I lay down fully clothed. The quilt covered me from shoulders to feet, heavier than it had any right to be. Not in a suffocating way. In a way that made my body aware of itself. Of gravity. Of being held in place. The house settled around me. Somewhere, a pipe clicked. The wind brushed against the siding. Nothing else moved. I stared at the ceiling and listened. I thought about how many nights she must have sat in that sewing room after I'd gone to bed. How often I'd passed by without stopping. How quiet she'd always been. Not distant. Just careful with words, like they cost something. The quilt rested against my chest, its weight steady and unchanging. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to comfort. Not relief. Not peace. Just a pause. A moment where the ache didn't ask me to explain it. Still, something lingered. The quilt felt different. Not just heavier in my hands, but heavier in meaning. As if it carried more than warmth. As if it remembered things I didn't. I pulled it closer, tucking it under my chin. The room stayed quiet. The house listened. And somewhere in the dark, beneath layers of fabric and careful stitches, I began to wonder if my mother had left more behind than silence. The quilt smelled like cedar and soap. The kind of clean that lingers in drawers you don't open often. It filled the room slowly, like it had been waiting for air. I spread it out across the bed, letting it unfold at its own pace. The fabric made a soft sound as it moved, dry, patient. Morning light slipped through the window and settled on it, catching threads I hadn't noticed before. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the colors wake up. They weren't bright. They never had been. Muted blues. Faded reds. Yellows worn soft as butter. I sat on the edge of the bed and leaned closer. That's when I started to recognize things. A square from the blue dress she wore to church when I was little, the one with the small tear at the hem she never fixed. A strip of fabric from the kitchen curtains, the ones that smelled like sun and frying oil in the afternoons. There, near the corner, a piece of flannel I knew too well. My childhood shirt. I reached out without thinking and touched it. The fabric was thinner than I remembered. Soft in a tired way. I could almost feel the weight of my younger self inside it. Knees pulled up, arms wrapped around my stomach, listening to her sewing machine hum late into the night. I hadn't realized she'd kept these things. Not just kept them, but chosen them. Each square was placed with intention. Nothing random. Nothing wasted. The seams didn't rush. They held. Some stitches were tight and precise. Others wandered slightly, like she'd paused mid-thought before continuing. I traced a line with my finger, slow and careful. There was a rhythm to it. Not a pattern you'd notice from across the room. Something quieter. The way certain colors repeated. The way heavier fabrics anchored lighter ones. The way worn pieces were surrounded, supported, never left on their own. I swallowed. While she was alive, I never questioned her quilts. They were just there. Folded neatly. Offered without ceremony when nights grew cold. I never asked why she worked so slowly. Why she unstitched and redid the same seam more than once. Now, sitting there, I felt the weight of all those unasked questions. The house was quiet behind me. No radio. No ticking clock. Just the faint sound of wind brushing the side of the house. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the fabric, breathing in that familiar scent again. Cedar. Soap. Time. I noticed something else then. The patterns weren't just pleasing. They were careful. Almost. Mapped. Colors that shouldn't have worked together somehow did. Repeated shapes appeared farther apart than expected, like they were answering each other across the quilt. It made my chest tighten. I ran my fingers over the stitches again, slower this time. Feeling where the thread dipped. Where it pulled. Where it hesitated. These weren't the hands of someone filling time. These were the hands of someone paying attention. Someone preserving something. I tried to remember her face when she sewed. The way her mouth would set into a small line. Not unhappy. Focused. As if she were listening to something beneath the noise of the world. She didn't talk much during those hours. If I asked her something, she'd answer softly, eyes never leaving her work. Just a minute. Almost there. I'd assumed she meant the quilt. Now I wasn't so sure. I lifted a corner and turned it over. The backing was plain, sturdy, functional. No decoration. All the care was on the surface, where it could be seen, but only if you were willing to look closely. I sat back and let my hands rest in my lap. The quilt felt less like a blanket now. More like a record. A collection of moments pressed flat and held together by thread. Things she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Things she thought might still matter. Things she thought might need remembering. The realization didn't come with noise or panic. Just a slow, uncomfortable awareness settling in my chest. Like realizing someone had been watching the whole time and choosing not to interrupt. I folded the quilt again, carefully this time. Aligning the edges. Matching the corners. My fingers moved the way hers must have, guided by memory I didn't know I had. When I finished, I rested my hand on top of it. It felt heavier than before. Not because of the fabric. Because of what it carried. I lay back on the bed and pulled it over me, the weight settling across my legs and chest. The smell surrounded me again, steady and grounding. The house creaked once, softly, like it approved. I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things we leave behind without meaning to. All the things we choose to save without knowing why. Somewhere beneath the layers of fabric and thread, my mother had been holding onto something. Maybe many things. Memories. Warnings. Proof that moments mattered, even when no one spoke them out loud. The quilt rested against me, quiet and patient. And for the first time, I wondered if it was meant to keep me warm, or to keep something alive until I was ready to see it. The afternoon light had shifted without me noticing. It leaned in through the window at an angle, lower now, catching dust in the air. The room felt quieter than before, as if the house had settled into a deeper listening. I was folding the quilt slowly. Not because it needed care, but because I did. Each fold felt like a decision. Each edge lined up carefully, the way she would have wanted it. The fabric brushed against my hands, soft and worn, carrying that same faint smell of cedar and soap. Familiar enough to comfort. Strange enough to keep me alert. Halfway through, my fingers stopped. There it was. A section where the stitching changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to call attention to itself from across the room. Just tighter. The thread pulled closer together, the seams drawn in like a muscle tensing beneath skin. The color shifted too, barely lighter, barely darker. Something you'd miss if you weren't already looking. I leaned closer. The quilt rested in my lap, its weight steady. My thumb followed the line of stitches, slower now. I could feel the difference. Where most of the quilt moved gently under pressure, this part resisted. Held firm. Like it was protecting something. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. The clock in the other room had stopped earlier that day. Or maybe I'd just stopped hearing it. Either way, time felt suspended, caught in the same careful pause as that tightened seam. I reached for the small sewing kit she'd left on the side table. It was still stocked. Needles aligned. Thread wrapped neatly around cardboard spools. I chose one without thinking, its tip catching the light briefly before dulling again. My hands hesitated. Undoing her work felt wrong. Like crossing a line she hadn't drawn, but I still felt. I imagined her fingers here, steady and certain. Imagined her watching me now, not angry, not surprised. Just quiet. I slid the needle beneath a single stitch. The thread gave way with a soft, almost apologetic sound. I froze. Guilt rose quickly, sharp and unwelcome. I hadn't planned to do this. Hadn't told myself I was looking for anything. I'd just been folding. Just noticing. I waited for something to change. Nothing did. The room stayed still. The light didn't shift. The house didn't protest. My breath sounded too loud in my own ears. I pulled the loose thread free. Just one stitch. That was all. I slipped my fingers into the opening, barely wide enough to feel inside. The fabric parted reluctantly, like it didn't want to be disturbed. That's when I felt it. Something firm. Not sharp. Not soft. Solid. Unmoving. My hand stilled instantly. The air in the room felt heavier, as if it had thickened around me. The walls seemed closer. The quiet pressed in harder than before, no longer passive. I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't push further either. I just stayed there, fingers resting against whatever my mother had sewn over so carefully. My pulse thudded once in my throat. I swallowed. This wasn't an accident. The stitching hadn't tightened by mistake. The color hadn't shifted because she ran out of thread. This had been intentional. Deliberate. A choice made slowly, probably after sitting with it for a long time. I tried to imagine the moment she decided to hide something inside the quilt. What her face looked like. Whether she hesitated the way I was hesitating now. The house made a small sound then, a settling noise deep in the walls. It startled me more than it should have. I pulled my hand back slightly, then stopped. I didn't want to know. I wanted to know. Both feelings sat side by side, unmoving. I smoothed the fabric closed again, pressing the edges together gently, as if apologizing. The loose thread rested against the surface, a quiet confession. I didn't remove anything else. Didn't widen the seam. Not yet. I folded the quilt the rest of the way, my movements slower now, more careful. Every square felt heavier. Every pattern seemed to watch me fold it into itself. When I finished, I set it on the bed and sat beside it. The room felt smaller than before. Not claustrophobic, just aware of itself. Like it knew something I didn't. I stared at the quilt for a long time. My mother had sewn her days into this thing. Her nights. Her silences. Whatever she'd hidden inside, she'd done it quietly. Without asking permission. Without explanation. That felt like her. I lay down and pulled the quilt over my legs, keeping the hidden seam near my knees. I could feel its weight there, subtle but present. A reminder. The light outside faded into evening. Shadows stretched along the walls. The house breathed around me, slow and measured. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. All I could think about was that single stitch. How easy it had been to undo. How hard it would be to stop now. Somewhere beneath the fabric, something waited. And I wasn't sure anymore whether the quilt had been keeping it safe from me, or keeping me safe from it. The light was thinner when I opened the seam again. Late afternoon, already leaning toward evening. The kind of light that doesn't forgive much. It shows dust. It shows where. It shows what you've been avoiding. I sat on the bed with the quilt folded across my lap, the loose stitch waiting where I'd left it. My hands rested on either side, palms down, like I was steadying myself before standing up. The house was quiet in a deeper way now. Not just silent, but attentive. I slid my fingers back into the opening. This time, I didn't stop. The fabric parted slowly, reluctantly, like it knew what was coming. Inside, the material felt different. Smoother. Tighter. My fingertips brushed against thread, not loose stuffing, not padding, but something worked carefully into the lining itself. I pulled the seam open just a little more. And then I saw them. Words. Small. Precise. Hand-stitched. Names. They were embroidered directly into the inner layer of the quilt, neat and restrained, each letter carefully formed. No flourishes. No decoration. Just quiet certainty. The thread was darker here, almost the color of dried leaves. I stared at the first one until my eyes burned. Mrs. Calder. My third-grade teacher. The one who used to keep peppermints in her desk drawer. The one who stopped coming to school halfway through the year. They said she'd moved to be closer to her sister. No one ever mentioned her again. My throat tightened. Below it, another name. Thomas Reed. A man who lived 2 streets over. I remembered his dog more than him, a big brown thing that used to sit in the shade like it was guarding something. One summer, both of them were gone. Someone said he'd found work out of state. Someone else said nothing at all. The room felt colder. I kept reading. Names I knew. Names I half knew. Names I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. A neighbor who stopped waving from her porch. A woman from church who always sat alone and then didn't sit anywhere anymore. A man whose house stayed empty so long the weeds grew taller than the mailbox. Each name was spaced carefully, never crowded. As if my mother wanted them to have room. As if she believed space was a kind of respect. I sat very still. My pulse moved slowly now, heavy and deliberate. I could hear my own breathing again. The quilt rested against my legs, warm on the outside, secretive within. She had never spoken about these people. Not once. I tried to remember a single conversation where she mentioned Mrs. Calder. Or Thomas Reed. Or any of the others stitched quietly into this hidden place. There was nothing. No passing comments. No gentle warnings. No late-night confessions. Just silence. My mother had been good at silence. Not the kind that shuts people out. The kind that watches. The kind that waits. I traced one name with my fingertip, barely touching the thread. It was tight beneath my skin, firm and unwavering. This wasn't rushed work. This was patient. Intentional. The hands of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The realization unsettled me more than the discovery itself. She hadn't sewn these names out of grief. Or nostalgia. She'd recorded them. I leaned back against the headboard, the quilt still open in my lap. The ceiling fan above me was still. The air felt thick, unmoving. Even the house seemed unsure how to respond. I wondered how long she'd been adding to it. Years. Decades. Whether she stitched a name only after confirming something for herself. Whether she waited. Watched. Knew. A memory surfaced then. Me, standing in the kitchen as a teenager. Asking her about someone I hadn't seen in a while. She'd been washing dishes, hands submerged, her back to me. She moved, she said. That was all. I'd accepted it without question. I pressed my lips together now, feeling something old and uncomfortable shift inside my chest. A recognition. A regret. These people hadn't just disappeared from town. They'd disappeared from conversation. And my mother had refused to let that be the end of it. I closed the quilt carefully, folding the inner layer back into place. The names vanished beneath fabric again, hidden but not gone. The loose thread rested on top, the only sign of what I now knew. I didn't sew it shut. Not yet. I folded the quilt once, then again, until it was compact and unassuming. Just another blanket. Just another thing left behind. I placed it beside me and sat there as the light outside faded completely. The room darkened gently, without drama. Street lights flickered on somewhere down the road. A car passed, tires humming softly against pavement. Life, continuing. I rested my hand on the folded quilt. My mother had sewn in silence. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew no one was listening. So she chose thread. Chose fabric. Chose patience. As the house settled into night, one thought stayed with me, steady and unresolved. She hadn't stitched those names for herself. She'd stitched them for someone who might one day be willing to look. And now that I had, I wasn't sure I could ever stop seeing them. The library windows were fogged when I arrived. Not from weather exactly, just age. Years of breath and winters pressing themselves into the glass. I wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve and looked inside before opening the door, like I needed permission from the past to step in. The bell above the door rang once. Soft. Apologetic. It smelled the same as it always had. Paper. Dust. Something faintly sweet, like old glue. The heat hummed low in the vents, never quite enough. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stood still, letting my eyes adjust. Nothing had changed. The same long tables. The same cork board with curling flyers. The same clock behind the desk, running a few minutes fast. I wondered how many people had come here looking for answers they weren't sure they were allowed to ask. I walked toward the back, where the newspapers were kept. Bound volumes, thick and tired, their spines cracked from years of hands opening the same stories again and again. I slid one free and carried it to a table by the window. The chair creaked when I sat down. Like it remembered. I opened to a random page at first, just to steady myself. Ads for grocery sales. A church picnic announcement. A high school honor roll. Life, laid out neatly in columns. Then I turned the page. A small headline caught my eye. Just a few lines. No photo. Local woman missing. My fingers tightened slightly on the paper. The article was brief. Vague. She was last seen walking home from work. No signs of struggle. Police believed she may have left town voluntarily. Anyone with information was asked to come forward. There was no follow-up. I flipped pages faster now, careful not to tear the brittle paper. Another mention. Another. Different names. Same language. Missing. Left town. No suspicion of foul play. My chest felt tight. I pulled the quilt from my bag and unfolded just enough to see the name stitched inside. I didn't lay it flat. I didn't want anyone to notice. I just needed to check. Mrs. Calder. There it was. Thomas Reed. Another match. Every name I found in the paper echoed back from the thread my mother had hidden so carefully. The realization settled over me slowly, like cold. This wasn't coincidence. This was corroboration. These weren't rumors. They were records. I looked up from the table then and noticed the librarian watching me. Not staring. Just aware. Her hands rested on the counter, fingers folded neatly. She didn't look away when our eyes met. She didn't smile either. I nodded, small and instinctive. She nodded back. That was all. I returned to the papers, but my attention drifted. I thought about the women whose names I'd read. The ones my mother used to sit beside at church. At school assemblies. At bake sales. They had folded their hands the same way she did. Kept their voices low. Smiled when expected. And then, one by one, they vanished. Not dramatically. No sirens. No memorials. Just empty seats and quiet explanations that didn't invite follow-up. I wondered how many people had noticed. How many had chosen not to. The library felt warmer suddenly, or maybe I was just more aware of the air. I closed the newspaper and returned it to its place. As I did, my fingers brushed another volume. I paused. Inside, tucked between pages, was a slip of paper. Yellowed. Handwritten. Just a date and a name. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother's. My breath caught. I slid the paper back where it had been and closed the book. I didn't take it with me. I didn't need to. The message was clear enough. She had been here. Watching. Reading. Recording. I gathered my things and walked toward the door. As I passed the front desk, the librarian spoke, not loudly. Not softly either. "Cold day," she said. I nodded. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated, then added, "Some people don't like to remember winter. But it tells you a lot about a place." I looked at her then. Really looked. The lines around her eyes were deep. Not from smiling. "I think so," I said. She nodded once, satisfied. Outside, the air was sharp. Clean. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting it settle in my lungs. Across the street, the church bell tower rose against the grey sky. Silent. I imagined my mother sitting in one of those pews, hands folded, eyes forward. Listening. Watching. Not speaking. Not forgetting. As I walked back to my car, the quilt pressed against my side, hidden beneath my coat. It felt heavier now, not with threat, but with purpose. My mother hadn't acted alone. She had been part of something quiet. A network of women who noticed when the world looked away. Who bore witness when no one asked them to. The question stayed with me as I drove home, the road stretching empty ahead. What exactly had she been watching for? And what had she been waiting to see before she stitched the final name? The lamp clicks on the same way it always did. A small sound. Almost polite. The light blooms slowly, a soft circle forming on the table, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Dust drifts through it, visible only for a moment before settling back into invisibility. I sit alone now, but I can still see her there. Not clearly. Just enough. Those evenings come back to me without warning. Not whole memories, more like impressions. The feel of the chair beneath me. The quiet hum of the house. The way night pressed gently against the windows, asking nothing. She sat at the sewing table, back straight, shoulders relaxed. The lamp was always positioned just so, angled to avoid glare. Her hands moved steadily, confidently, as if they knew the work better than she did. Needle in. Needle out. Thread pulled tight, then eased. She didn't speak much then. Neither did I. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It felt agreed upon. Like we'd both signed something invisible. I would sit nearby, pretending to read or do homework, though most of the time I just watched the light shift across the fabric in her hands. Watched the way her fingers paused before choosing the next stitch. watched her breathe. Sometimes the house made small sounds. Pipes clicking. Wood settling. The refrigerator sighing to itself. She never reacted to those. But there were moments. Moments when her hands stopped. The needle would hover mid-air. The thread would go slack. Her head would lift slightly, not enough to look around. Just enough to listen. I remember thinking she was tired. Or worried. There had always been things to worry about. Money. Weather. People. I assumed her pauses belonged to those ordinary concerns. The kind adults never fully explain. She never said anything when she stopped like that. She just waited. Still as the fabric beneath her hands. Then, after a moment, she'd resume sewing. Calm. Unrushed. As if whatever she'd been listening for had either passed, or been confirmed. At the time, I didn't ask. Now, sitting in that same room with the same lamp glowing softly, the memory lands differently. Heavier. The table is empty now. No fabric. No thread. Just the faint grooves where years of work wore the surface smooth. I run my hand over it, feeling the places where her wrists must have rested night after night. She had been vigilant. Not anxious. Attentive. There's a difference I didn't understand back then. I think about the way she used to tilt her head when listening. Just slightly. Like she was tuning into something faint. Something most people would miss if they weren't trying. It wasn't the house she was listening to. It was the world beyond it. I replay one memory in particular. A winter evening. Wind rattling the windows. I was younger, still small enough that my feet didn't reach the floor. She was sewing darker fabric that night. Heavy. Stubborn. Halfway through a stitch, she stopped. Her fingers tightened around the needle. She looked toward the window, not directly. Just past it. As if her attention had moved somewhere else entirely. I remember the feeling then. A subtle shift in the room. Not fear. Awareness. I asked her what was wrong. She didn't look at me. Nothing, she said. But she didn't go back to sewing right away. She waited. At the time, I accepted that answer because it was easier than questioning it. Because I trusted her. Because I didn't know how much could hide inside a single word. Now, I wonder what she heard that night. A car slowing on the street. A voice raised somewhere nearby. A silence that lasted too long. I wonder how often she noticed things no one else did. How often she carried those moments alone, folding them into her work, pressing them flat with thread and patience. The quilt rests folded beside me now. Knowing what I know, I imagine her sewing differently. Each stitch not just an act of creation, but of attention. Of record. Of listening. The lamp hums softly above me. The house is quiet again, but not empty. I sit there longer than I need to, letting the memory breathe. Letting the discomfort settle where comfort used to be. It's not painful. Just clarifying. She hadn't been distracted. She had been alert. And she hadn't spoken because speaking wasn't safe. Or useful. Or enough. Listening was. I turn the lamp off. The room darkens, but the shape of the table remains visible, outlined by moonlight slipping through the window. For a moment, I almost expect to hear the soft pull of thread. The whisper of fabric shifting under practiced hands. Instead, there's only the quiet. But now I recognize it for what it is. Not absence. Attention. As I stand to leave the room, one thought stays with me, steady and unresolved. All those years, while I thought she was sewing, she was listening for something. And I'm starting to realize she may have been waiting for the moment someone else finally did too. The quilt takes up most of the floor when I lay it out. I move the coffee table aside. Push the chair back. Clear a space that feels suddenly ceremonial. The house watches quietly as I kneel down, smoothing the corners flat, one by one. Morning light spills in through the windows, pale and honest. It stretches across the fabric, settling into seams, catching thread. From this angle, the quilt doesn't look like a blanket at all. It looks like something waiting to be read. I sit back on my heels and let my eyes travel slowly. Not scanning. Not searching. Just noticing. At first, it's only color, shape, balance. The way she always worked, nothing too bold, nothing shouting for attention. Comforting. Familiar. A thing you'd wrap yourself in without thinking twice. Then something shifts. A blue strip lines up with another, farther down. A triangle of darker cloth points toward a patch I recognize from the old grocery store awning. A curve of pale fabric mirrors the bend in the river that runs behind town. My breath slows. I lean forward. The names are still hidden beneath the top layer, but now I don't need to see them. I know where they are. I can feel them in the way the quilt holds itself. The way certain areas pull tighter. The way others breathe. I follow the shapes with my finger. A long line. Interrupted by a square. Another line, branching off. Streets. I know these streets. I've walked them. Ridden my bike along them. Driven them half asleep, muscle memory doing the work. I recognize the distance between landmarks. The odd spacing where nothing ever quite fit. The quilt mirrors it all. My stomach tightens, slow and steady. This isn't design. It's mapping. I trace the edge of a fabric rectangle that matches the old school building. The cloth is sturdy there, reinforced. Around it, lighter pieces. Children's clothing, maybe. Movement. Noise. Life. Farther out, near the edge, the colors grow darker. The fabric's heavier. The names, stitched beneath, I know now, cluster in places that feel deliberate. Not random. Documented. I sit back again, heart beating a little louder now, and let the realization settle fully. My mother had been recording the town. Not just who lived where, but who stopped. Who vanished quietly. Who drifted out of place. Who was last seen near which corner, which road, which stretch of quiet. The quilt isn't meant to comfort. It's meant to remember. I think of all the nights she spent sewing. Of how slow she was. How careful. How she unpicked stitches without frustration, as if getting it right mattered more than getting it done. I thought she was making something warm. She was making something accurate. I run my hand over the center of the quilt, where the fabric is most worn. The heart of town. The places people gathered. The places people assumed were safe. There are fewer names there. That feels intentional too. My chest aches, not sharply, but deeply. A dull understanding pressing in from all sides. She hadn't been imagining connections. She'd been tracing them. I imagine her sitting at the table, late at night, laying fabric pieces out the way I am now. Testing placement. Adjusting. Moving one square an inch to the left, then back again. Making sure it aligned. Listening. Watching. I hear her voice in my head, not saying much. Just breathing. Just present. The quilt lies there, exposed in a way it never has been before. Its secret isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, waiting for someone to kneel down long enough to see it. A ledger disguised as comfort. That thought stays with me. I press my palm flat against a section near the edge. The fabric is cool, almost stiff. This is where the names felt heaviest when I first wrapped myself in it. This is where the disappearances gathered. I don't need to open the seams again. The map speaks without words now. I sit there until my legs go numb. Until the light shifts and shadows stretch across the floor, breaking the quilt into segments again. Streets dissolving back into fabric. Evidence returning to disguise. When I finally fold it, I do so carefully. Reverently. The way you close a book you aren't finished with. As I lift it, the weight surprises me again. Not physically. Responsibly. I carry it back to the bed and set it down, smoothing it once, as if that might quiet whatever has been stirred. The room feels different now. Smaller. More honest. I think about my mother. About how little she said. About how much she left behind without explanation. She hadn't written a letter. Hadn't labeled the quilt. Hadn't told anyone what it meant. Which means she hadn't known who would find it. Only that someone might. I sit on the edge of the bed, the folded quilt beside me, and let the question rise slowly, unavoidably. Who was meant to read this after her? The answer doesn't come. Not yet. But the quilt feels patient. And for the first time, I understand why she took so long with every stitch. She wasn't just preserving the past. She was waiting for the future to catch up. The neighbor's porch light was already on when I arrived. It cast a weak yellow circle onto the steps, moths drifting in and out like they couldn't decide whether to stay. Evening had settled in quietly, the way it always did here. No announcement, just a cooling of the air and a deepening of shadows. I stood at the bottom of the steps longer than I meant to. The quilt was folded over my arm, heavier than it should have been. The house behind the porch looked small, tired, like it had been holding memories for too long. When I knocked, the sound felt too loud. It took a while before the door opened. She stood there slightly hunched, wrapped in a cardigan that had seen many winters. Her hair was thin and white, pulled back neatly. Her eyes were clouded with age, but sharp. Too sharp to miss anything important. She looked at me, then at the quilt. Her mouth parted just slightly. "Oh," she said. Not my name. Not hello. Just, "Oh." She stepped aside without another word. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Everything was covered, plastic over the sofa, doilies on the tables. A life carefully preserved, but not lived in much anymore. She gestured for me to sit. I didn't unfold the quilt right away. I set it between us on the coffee table. Her hands moved before her words did. Trembling fingers reached out, hovering for a moment like she needed permission from the air itself. When she touched the fabric, her shoulders sagged. She closed her eyes. "I wondered where she'd put it," she said. The sentence landed quietly. "Heavy. You recognize it?" I asked. She nodded, still not looking at me. "I do." She smoothed the edge of the quilt with the back of her hand. A gesture so familiar it made my throat ache. I'd seen my mother do that same thing, calm a piece of fabric as if it could feel nerves. She always had the steadiest hands, the woman said. Even when the rest of us didn't. I waited. Silence stretched between us, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt practiced. "She was part of us," the woman continued finally. "Your mother." "Part of what?" I asked. Her eyes lifted then. Met mine fully. The ones who noticed. That was all she said at first. Then, more quietly, the ones who remembered. She leaned back, the effort visible. Her gaze drifted toward the darkened window. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly, tires whispering against pavement. "When someone stopped coming to church," she said, "or didn't pick up their kids anymore, most folks didn't ask. Asking made things uncomfortable." Her fingers tightened slightly in the quilt. "We asked anyway," she added. "Just not out loud." I felt a chill move through me, slow and deliberate. She told me then, without names, without dates. Just impressions. Women who met without meeting. Who sat side by side and spoke about recipes, weather, aches in their joints. All the while watching who was missing from the room. They noticed patterns. They noticed when explanations didn't line up. They noticed when someone left behind shoes by the door that never got worn again. And you couldn't say anything. I asked. She smiled faintly. "Oh, we could've," she said. "Once." The smile faded. Then never again. She reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out a small pincushion. Old. Stained. Bristling with bent needles. "This was our mouth," she said, holding it up. "Thread and fabric. That's how we talked." I thought of my mother's quilts. The patience. The precision. The silence. "She was afraid," the woman said softly. "But not for herself." My breath caught. "She was afraid for you." The words settled into me slowly, like snow. "For me." I echoed. She nodded. "You were young. Still growing. She didn't want you to see what we were seeing. Didn't want you asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." Her hand returned to the quilt, pressing gently at one corner. "There are things people will protect," she said. "And there are things they'll punish anyone for naming." I thought of the map hidden in fabric. Of names sewn beneath the surface. Of streets I knew by heart. What danger? I asked quietly. What were you protecting me from? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she folded the quilt carefully, expertly, and handed it back to me. Her hands shook more now, the effort catching up to her. "Not danger," she said at last. "Truth." She looked tired suddenly. "Very old. Truth has a way of making people angry when it comes too early," she added. I stood to leave, the quilt pressed against my chest. At the door, I turned back. "She trusted you," I said. The woman nodded once. "And now," she replied, "she's trusting you." Outside, the porch light hummed softly. The night air felt colder than before, sharper in my lungs. I walked home slowly, each step deliberate. The quilt felt heavier with every block. Not with fear. With inheritance. As I reached my door, one thought stayed with me, quiet but insistent. Whatever my mother had been protecting me from, she believed one day I would be strong enough to face it. The room is quiet, but not empty. Sunlight drifts through the curtains in lazy, gold street stripes. Dust motes float lazily, catching the light just enough to remind me the house is breathing. I sit on the edge of the bed, the quilt folded across my lap. Its weight presses down, not heavy, exactly, but insistently, like a reminder I can't set aside. I run my fingers over the stitches, tracing familiar curves and tight knots. There's comfort here. Familiarity. Yet something deeper presses beneath it, subtle but unyielding. I feel it in the way the fabric resists my touch, as if it remembers more than I do. It occurs to me slowly. This isn't just evidence. It's confession. Not one written in ink or spoken aloud. Not a declaration in words. But a quiet, persistent testimony stitched in thread, tucked between scraps of cloth, hidden from casual eyes. My mother had seen. She had remembered. She had archived. I close my eyes and let memories drift back, unbidden. Evenings spent near her sewing table. The lamp casting a soft circle of light on the floor. Her hands moving steadily, almost ritualistically. The way she paused sometimes, not from fatigue, not from distraction, but from listening. Listening to the world beyond the room. Listening to what others refused to see. Back then, I assumed she could fix things. I thought her silence meant she had control. But now I understand differently. She couldn't change the outcomes. She couldn't prevent the disappearances, the absences, the quiet heartbreaks that ran through the town. All she could do was hold them in. And she did. The quilt spreads across my lap, warm and dense. Each patch a fragment of life she had noticed when the rest of the world looked away. The careful arrangement of names, the deliberate tightness of some stitches, the empty spaces left where absence itself had been recorded. She refused erasure. I hold the quilt tighter, feeling the slow, deliberate pulse of her resolve. It is louder here than it ever was in her voice. In life, she spoke little. But every thread, every careful knot, carries a quiet insistence, I saw. I remembered. I will not let this be forgotten. I trace a square with my finger, recognizing a familiar pattern. A neighborhood street, a house, a name. I can feel her watching through the fabric, still attentive, still protective. Her restraint, her patience, her refusal to intervene. It's clearer now than it ever was before. I let my hand linger on the stitches over the man who vanished. The paths around his name converge like veins in the quilt. His presence, his absence, the uncertainty of what happened, all pressed into the fabric. She could not speak openly. She could not act openly. She could only sew. And in sewing, she bore witness. The realization presses in slowly. This isn't just a record. It's a moral ledger. A testament of endurance. And now it rests with me. I lean back against the pillows, letting the quilt drape over my shoulders. The weight is grounding, almost sacred. I imagine her at the table, stitching late into the night, a quiet sentinel. She couldn't change the world. But she could refuse to let it forget. That, I realize, is a kind of power too. A responsibility I hadn't anticipated. I look at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of light as the sun moves across the sky. The quiet of the house presses in, and for a moment, I feel the full measure of what she carried. The stillness isn't empty. It's deliberate. It's patient. And it's instructive. Holding the quilt, I feel her presence more clearly than any memory of her voice. The restraint she maintained in life, the careful selection of what to see, what to record, what to act on, is all here. Thread and cloth made flesh in her absence. I think of the names, the streets, the vanished faces preserved in the fabric. I think of the neighbor who confirmed the group she belonged to, women who noticed and refused to forget. And I understand. She trusted someone to carry it forward. That someone is me. The weight of the quilt is heavier now, not in pounds, but in consequence. The responsibility is palpable. To honor memory. To bear witness. To recognize injustice quietly, and yet not let it slip entirely into the shadows. I fold the quilt once, then twice, and feel the edges press into my hands. It is deliberate, exact, reverent. The room holds its breath around me, the dust motes hanging suspended in sunlight. I am aware of the house, the way the floor creaks, the way the air holds a faint scent of cedar and thyme. I close my eyes and exhale slowly. Her silence was not absence. Her restraint was not weakness. Her refusal to intervene was not surrender. It was the careful, unspoken act of recording the world as it was. And now, the act passes to me. I place the folded quilt at the foot of the bed. The fabric feels warm, as though it retains her presence. Outside, the wind shifts, rattling the windows softly, a quiet reminder that the world keeps moving, even when we are still. I sit in the fading light and let the quiet fill me. The responsibility is mine now, heavy and unwavering, stitched into the same fabric that held her resolve. And I know, without needing to speak it aloud, that looking away is no longer an option. The house waits with me, silent but alert, as if it has always known what must come next. The rain had started sometime in the night. By morning, it tapped softly against the windows, steady and patient. The kind of rain that doesn't rush. That doesn't announce itself. It just stays. I laid the quilt out on the bed again, slower this time. More careful. As if it might react to being handled differently. The room smelled faintly damp, the air cooler than yesterday. I didn't turn on the lamp. I let the grey light do the work. That's when the name found me. Not because I was looking for it. Because it wanted to be seen. The stitching there was tighter. Denser. The thread pulled deeper into the fabric, darker than the rest. The letters pressed down hard, as if my mother's hands had lingered longer over this one. I knew the name immediately. Everyone did. He was the man people lowered their voices about. The one who left town suddenly. The one who'd been mentioned once or twice after, then not at all. They said he ran. Said he knew something was coming. They said a lot of things. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the stitches, my hands resting uselessly in my lap. The rain tapped on. The house stayed quiet. It felt like a moment you weren't supposed to interrupt. I traced the letters with my eyes. They didn't sit lightly in the quilt the way the others did. They were anchored. Surrounded by reinforced seams. Lines of fabric converged there, like roads meeting at a single point. Paths crossed at his name. I thought of the map I'd seen before. Of how carefully the town had been mirrored in cloth. This name wasn't on the edge. It wasn't fading outward like the others. It was central. I swallowed. I'd grown up hearing that he'd fled. That he'd packed up overnight and disappeared before anyone could stop him. It had always felt like a convenient ending. A story with no loose ends because no one wanted to pull on them. But the quilt didn't tell that story. The quilt told a different one. I went to the small desk by the window and pulled open the drawer. Inside were notes I'd made since finding the names. Dates. Locations. Questions that didn't have answers yet. I spread them out beside me on the bed. Every path led back to him. Every disappearance brushed past his name. I felt a slow, creeping discomfort settle into my chest. Not fear. Recognition. Records at the library hadn't shown him leaving town. No bus ticket. No job transfer. No forwarded address. Just absence. He hadn't fled. He'd vanished. I looked back at the quilt. At the way my mother's stitches tightened around his name, circling it, pressing down as if to keep it from rising up. As if fabric and thread could hold a truth in place. This wasn't decoration. This was accusation. I imagined her sewing this section. The way her jaw must have set. The way her hands might have pressed harder, the thread pulled tighter than usual. I imagined the silence in the room then, not peaceful. Intent. She had known. Or suspected enough to mark it. I pressed my thumb gently against the stitches, feeling the firmness beneath. They resisted me. Held their shape. She hadn't wanted this name to loosen over time. Hadn't wanted it to fade the way memory does when no one tends it. The rain grew heavier outside. I remembered passing his house as a child. The way the curtains were always drawn. The way the yard stayed trimmed even after he was gone, for a while. Then the weeds crept in. Then the house emptied out, like it had exhaled and never breathed back in. People stopped walking on that side of the street. I'd never asked why. I lay back on the bed, the quilt spread over my legs, his name resting somewhere near my knees. It felt wrong to cover it, but worse to leave it exposed. My mother had lived with this knowledge quietly. Had carried it without confrontation, without justice, without reassurance that anyone would believe her if she spoke. So she stitched. She mapped. She recorded. Not to punish, but to prevent forgetting. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain. It sounded like counting. Like time marking itself. When I opened them again, I knew the answer to the question that had been circling me since the beginning. Yes. This was her way of accusing him. Not with words. Not with noise. With permanence. With proof that refused to disappear the way he had. I folded the quilt carefully, his name disappearing beneath layers of fabric. But I could still feel it there. A weight that didn't shift no matter how I held it. As I placed the quilt back at the foot of the bed, one thought stayed with me, steady and unsettling. My mother hadn't been waiting for him to be found. She had been waiting for someone else to be brave enough to look where everyone else had stopped. And now that I had, I wasn't sure I could ever look away again. The house is quiet this morning, the kind of quiet that hums softly in your ears. Sunlight drifts across the floors in pale gold strips, slipping through curtains I never drew last night. I carry the quilt carefully, folding my arms around it as if it might shift beneath me. Each step creaks against the boards like it remembers my mother walking here, long ago. The sewing room door is closed. I pause before it, hand on the knob. The air smells faintly of cedar and the faint tang of old cloth. Everything here is untouched, her chair slightly pulled back, a pin cushion bristling on the table, the scissors resting exactly where she left them. The room seems to inhale as I step inside. I lay the quilt across the table, smoothing it with deliberate care. The sunlight catches the patterns, illuminating names, paths, and stitched stories. For a moment, I just watch it, letting the room and its quiet speak to me. The weight that pressed on me for days now feels lighter, almost steadying. I sit back on my heels, my fingers resting lightly on the fabric. The stories woven in here, absences, memory, vigilance, don't need retelling. They exist quietly, insistently, beneath my fingertips. I trace one of the lines, imagining the roads it mirrors, the people it preserves, the silences it refuses to let fade. This room, this table, the morning light, it all feels right. Complete. I realize, slowly, that the quilt was never just about holding grief or fear. It was about keeping presence. Preserving memory. Archiving what the world tried to ignore. And now, it's my turn to respect that work, to honor it without undoing it. I breathe in, letting the faint smell of fabric and cedar fill my lungs. The sun shifts, stretching across the table, drawing lines along the stitches. It feels deliberate, almost ceremonial. I understand that telling its story won't require words shouted, or explanations forced. She would have wanted quiet. Patient revelation. Observed understanding. I close my eyes briefly, imagining her here, the lamp warm beside her, hands moving steadily, mind alert to the world. How she listened to absence, recorded it, bore it, even when no one else could see. Her silence was deliberate, a protection. Not from me, not from anyone specific, but from chaos itself. And now, the quilt is full. Balanced. Entire. I run my fingers along the edges, feeling every knot, every tightened stitch. The names are settled. The roads mapped. The story's preserved. The weight I once carried is now shifted. It isn't mine to bear, but mine to witness. I think about the times I held the quilt before, wrapping it around my shoulders like a shield. It was heavy then, burdened with questions I couldn't answer. But today, laid flat, it feels resolved. The urgency has quieted. The tension in the stitches speaks in calm, deliberate rhythm. She wasn't asking me to fix anything. Just to see, to remember, to continue carefully. I stepped back from the table, letting my gaze sweep over the room. Her scissors, the lamp, the chair, the quilt, all arranged as if waiting for someone to recognize their purpose. The room doesn't demand attention. It offers it quietly. And I feel it, in the deep part of my chest where memory lingers. I realize that sharing the quilt story, as she would have wanted, is not about recounting every name or event. It's about respect, patience, seeing the lives stitched into cloth without needing to undo them. To understand the vigilance, the care, the silent insistence that nothing, no person, no detail, be forgotten. I take a final breath, letting the morning light fall fully across the quilt. It feels like acknowledgement, like an answer I've been waiting for. The weight is gone, not disappeared, but transformed into presence, into legacy. As I turn toward the door, I pause. My hand lingers on the knob, and I feel a quiet question rising. The work my mother began, the careful observation, the meticulous recording, the act of holding memory, was hers. But now, as I step away, I wonder, am I continuing her work, honoring it with careful hands and quiet eyes, or beginning my own? I step into the hallway. The quilt stays behind, spread across the table, bathed in sunlight. Its story rests there, patient and complete, waiting for the next observer, the next careful witness. The house exhales softly behind me. The floor creaks like it remembers. And I walk on, carrying the quiet resolve she left stitched into every thread.